Go. Hello and welcome to another session of our study of the book of Hebrews or the Epistle to the Hebrews. And we're going to finish up chapter 2 today. And then next month we'll jump into chapter 3. Really, chapter 3, verse 1 is not only introducing a new chapter, obviously, but it's introducing a brand new section. And so it wouldn't make sense for me to do the rest of what we're going to do today and then jump into a new section. That really deserves its own introduction, its own time, its own space. And so we'll do the best we can with all the verses we have right now, which actually I think makes a really, really strong argument for the humanity of Jesus and how Jesus relates to us. In fact, you could potentially make the argument that this particular chapter, Hebrews chapter 2, makes one of the strongest arguments for the full humanity of Jesus. And that's important because Jesus is portrayed as someone who has gone ahead of us and he has endured and he was faithful to God and he has flesh and blood. And we can look to him as our example. We can look to how he has endured and shown his faithfulness to God, and we can draw inspiration from that because certainly he had it more difficult than we do. So if we're struggling, we could say, okay, well, Jesus is able to conquer all these things. uh, you know, God expects us to be able to do the same thing. And the benefit for us is that we actually have Jesus as a high priest who's able to reach out and help and assist us. And we're going to get a little bit of a preview of that in our section today. So without further ado, we're just going to get started. Go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, I think I need to change this. All right. I think I'm in full. I think we're in full screen right now. If not, someone will stop me and tell me. So, okay. All right. So we're going to look at chapter 2, verses 10 through 18. And I thought a good summary for this section would be referring to Christ's solidarity with his human brothers. I could put human brothers and sisters, but I think you kind of understand that brothers is just another way of talking about family members. And not only are we going to see verse after verse after verse after verse of the author really making the point that Jesus was as human as you and I, but he's also going to make the argument of this point from a variety of Old Testament passages that I feel like get overlooked. And so it's just a super, super strong argument. And this is a problem, of course, if you think that Jesus either pre-existed as an angel or pre-existed as a spirit being or pre-existed as a member of the Trinity and that he assumed humanity, then Jesus is not a real human being. But the author of Hebrews chapter 2 is making it very clear that he is just as human as you and I are. So that seems to suggest he's fully human. Okay, let's read through this passage and we'll come back and we'll talk about, I think, some of the major points. For it was fitting for him, and I do think this is now referring to God, it was fitting for God, for whom are all things and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through suffering. So this is God perfecting Jesus, the salvation, the author of their salvation, that is the children, the many children. Okay, for both he who sanctifies, that's Jesus, and those who are sanctified, that's believers, are all from one. We'll have to come back and talk about that. For which reason he, Jesus, is not ashamed to call them brethren, brothers and sisters, saying, quote from the Old Testament, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And again, another quote from the Old Testament. I will put my trust in him. And again, another quote. Behold, I and the children God has given to me. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he, Jesus, might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and he might free those who, through the fear of death, were subject to slavery all their lives. For assuredly he, Jesus, does not give help to angels, but he gives help to the descendant of Abraham, the seed of Abraham. Therefore he, Jesus, had to be made like his brethren in all things. Why? So that he, Jesus, might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For since he himself, Jesus, was tempted in that which he has suffered, he's able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. All right. So let's come back and talk about these passages. So we'll start here looking at verses 10 through 11. I think it's good in the midst of Hebrews, which I feel like every single sentence is super, super deep, to just kind of stop and have the exercise of trying to summarize what these individual verses are saying. Otherwise, we'll focus on the big picture and we might miss a lot of these details. Okay, so God has perfected Jesus, and Jesus, of course, is our human brother. All right, so we see here the subject here. It was fitting for him. This is God, and God is the one in his process of bringing many sons to glory. That is, God is leading or bringing his children to glory. That's us. That's believers. God is leading his children to glory. What is the glory? That's the kingdom of God. So how is God doing this? It's fitting for God in his process of leading his children to glory to perfect. This is God perfecting the author of their salvation. All right. So God has perfected Christ. God has made Christ perfect. And how did he do it? He did it through sufferings, through the sufferings of Jesus. Of course, the sufferings of Jesus means his rejection, his betrayal, his crucifixion, and of course, obviously, his death, okay, which, of course, God raised Jesus from the dead, vindicating him and giving Jesus immortality. And so, of course, naturally, it makes sense that if God has perfected Christ and Christ was perfected through suffering, then Christ is not inherently divine, okay? If God made Christ perfect through the suffering and resurrection of Jesus, then Christ naturally was not perfect, okay? And we know that because it's not that he was imperfect like he was sinful. It was the fact that he wasn't perfected because he was mortal. He was capable of dying. And of course, if you're dead, you're not perfected. Okay. The perfection comes when God grants you immortality. Okay. And this language of perfection is going to reappear in the book of Hebrews, particularly in chapter 5, where it's going to talk about Jesus. Although he was a son, he became perfect through obedience, to where he obeyed to the point of death. He obeyed to the point where he suffered. And so he was perfected in that sense. All right. And so the risen Christ is, by the way, here, the one who now sanctifies believers. Okay. In the Old Testament, the one who sanctified believers was God, but I think God has now handed that over to Jesus. And it's interesting to think, in what capacity is Jesus sanctifying people? Okay. Well, in the Old Testament, there was a sense of sanctification that took place for the Israelites, and that took place in the temple. And that was mediated through a variety of priests, through the priesthood. Okay. Now, for a lot of Christians, the fact that Jesus is the high priest, that's just something like we all know. We all know that Jesus is the high priest. Okay. But if you'll remember, that is only taught in the book of Hebrews. And if we're being careful, that has actually not been brought up in our reading of Hebrews just yet. Okay. Now, just assuming we're getting, like, if you take to the point that we are at chapter 2, verse 11, we have not gotten to that point yet. Okay. Now, by the end of chapter 2, it does come up. Okay. And we need to kind of assume that the author, who is going to be saying something that is not said in the Gospels, it's not said explicitly in Paul, it's not said in the book of Revelation, it's a distinctive contribution in the book of Hebrews. He has to build up and make that argument, because it's not something that without the book of Hebrews you would have concluded on your own. So I think it's the risen Jesus who sanctifies believers specifically in his role as the high priest. All right. So you see this interesting passage here. It's in verse 11. Okay. He who sanctifies, that's Jesus, and those who are sanctified are all from one. Okay. Now, if you're reading in your translation, okay, there's two different ways that this word one, this adjective, can be rendered. Okay. Because adjectives in Greek, they match the grammatical gender of that which they're modifying. Okay. And in a rare sense of grammatical ambiguity, this particular word for one could either be masculine or it could be neuter. Now, you can't tell this by looking at your English translation, okay? But it's like a basic year one point if you're looking at the Greek text, okay? And so if you're reading it in English, at least the way that I have it rendered here, it says basically Christ and believers, they're all from one. And the question is, we're all from one what? Okay, because the adjective is modifying something, okay? So if the adjective is masculine, okay, then Christ and believers all come from one person who is masculine, namely the Father, okay? And that's a big deal. That means that Jesus comes out of the Father and all believers come out of the Father. That just means that God is the Father, is the creator, okay? That's good news for us, okay? All right. If it's neuter, as in Christ and believers all come from one source, namely all one source of humanity, that's also good news for us because it proves that Jesus is as human as you and I are, okay? So how do you decide which one was the author trying to say? I think it's unlikely the author's trying to say both these things. But the reality is you can make a good argument for both of these realities, okay? And as we continue to read through, you can decide what you actually think is happening here. So let me just make sure that we're clear on this point, okay? Because it's a technical point that I think if you just had the English translation, you would not have caught it unless you're reading different translations. So the New American Standard will say that they're all from one Father, and they'll put the word Father in italics to let you know they've kind of added that in there. The New Revised Standard Version also has one Father, but the ESV says all from one source, okay? So their different translations are taking it different ways. But the reality is, like, both of them are true, and both of them actually teach that Christ was created and that Christ was a human being, okay? So I think today, the thing is, like, man, you're trying to figure out, like, what is the author trying to say here? I'm probably, I would say 70-30 on that they're all coming from one source, as in they're all coming from a shared humanity. And I think it's because the author continues to unpack his argument by making the fact that they all have a shared humanity. But the thing is, that also could be said if they all come from one Father. If they all come from one Father, then they're all sons. They're all children. Okay? So it's just interesting. Okay. So I think the purpose statement, the purpose statement. The purpose statement is, let me actually draw it on here so you can see how it works. All right. So this is the purpose statement. Okay. For which reason? Okay. So notice, he who sanctifies is Jesus, and those who are sanctified are all from one. Okay. For which reason? Okay. He's not ashamed to call them brethren, brothers and sisters. Okay. So there's something about Jesus calling you and I brethren, brothers and sisters, that relates to this word right here. Okay. So either we're all from one Father, as in we're all God's children, including Jesus, who is the Son of God. Okay. Or we all descend from one common humanity. Okay. Which means that we're all brothers and sisters anyway. Okay. So both are true, and both are a problem if you believe in the Trinity. I'll tell you that. Okay. It's kind of an interesting point. So the purpose statement, as you can see there, emphasizes the shared family ties and their humanity. All right. So hopefully I explained that interesting point. So, but that's why different translations will say something different after the word one on that passage. Okay. All right. So verses 12 and 13 have a combined 3 quotations from the Old Testament. All right. And the passages from which the author of Hebrews is quoting from are passages that are elsewhere used in the New Testament that indicate a messianic awareness of these passages. The first one is Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is quoted by Jesus on the cross in Matthew and Mark's gospel. Psalm 22, verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay. So, of course, who is speaking originally in Psalm 22? Well, the answer to that is David, is King David. All right. So, this is quoting from Psalm 22, verse 22. And in Hebrews, in the book of Hebrews, the subject of saying is actually Christ. Okay. So remember, Christ is not ashamed to call all of us brethren. And then why is that true? Because, first quotation from the Old Testament, where Jesus is saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation. I will sing your praise. Okay. So, but originally in the Old Testament, you go back and read Psalm 22, this is David. Okay. And David is not on the cross. Okay. But David, he's surrounded by his enemies. His life is in peril. He's about to die. And so he feels that God has abandoned him. And so he's crying out. He's asking for God's forgiveness. He's trusting in God's faithfulness. And of course, by the end of the psalm, God has saved David. He's vindicated David. And David is still alive, which is why David is able to write the psalm. Okay. So, but by the time you get to verse 22, this is David indicating his appreciation to God for rescuing and vindicating him. Okay. So the point is, we have a passage about David who is saying, in appreciation for God rescuing him and vindicating him, that I'm going to tell of your name. I, David, am going to tell of your God's name to my brothers and sisters. And he's going to do this in the midst of a congregation where he's going to sing your praise. Okay. All right. So what we have here is an application of a David passage to Jesus, to the point where Hebrews is saying, this is what Jesus is saying right now. Jesus is saying what David said hundreds of years ago. Okay. Now, here's one of the key points. By taking a passage about David and applying it to Jesus, that does not mean the author is saying that Jesus is David. That's not his argument. Okay. And I'm making this point because we spent an entire session looking at Hebrews chapter 1, verse 10, where we had a Yahweh passage being applied to Jesus. And I tried to make the argument that while it is true it's a Yahweh passage being applied to Jesus, the author's not trying to say that Yahweh is Jesus. Well, how can I say that? Well, because here we got a David passage being applied to Jesus, but the author's not saying that Jesus is David. It's just a flexible way in which the author is using the Old Testament to now apply to things that are true about Jesus. Okay. So it's quoting an Old Testament passage and using it to refer to Jesus without trying to identify Jesus now with the Old Testament referent. And this will become clear by the next slide. All right. So David would report how God vindicated him from a near-death situation to his brothers. And in the same way, Christ praises God, notice the distinction there, in the midst of the congregation of fellow brothers. So both David and Christ are distinguished from God, that's clear, and are themselves human beings with human brothers and sisters. So you can see that the author is trying to say, look, Jesus comes from the same source as you and I. So he's not ashamed to call his brothers and sisters. Let me quote an Old Testament passage to prove that. Here we have, I will tell your name to my brothers. A passage about David, and now it's being referred to Jesus, who is basically saying, I, Jesus, am going to tell of your name, God, to my brothers. So it's now Jesus talking about his own brothers and sisters. Okay? And you also have Jesus praising God, which is very interesting. If Jesus is God, why would he be praising someone else called God? Doesn't make much sense. Okay, now, this right here is one of these places to where the author of Hebrews is just he's going to hint at something, and he's not going to reveal it until much later in the book of Hebrews. And if you're not really, really aware of the contents of the book of Hebrews, this is going to go right over your head. You're going to miss it. Okay. So here he's going to talk about this. He says, in the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. Okay. Why would the author want to cite this particular part of the psalm in reference to Jesus? So Jesus right now, it's saying, before I click this point, Jesus in the midst of a congregation is singing God's praise. Okay, so where is this? Where is this congregation? Where is this? Okay, it's a typical word for church. Okay, but so it could be translated as congregation or assembly or whatever it may be. But it only appears one more time in Hebrews, which is the other time that the author is going to allude to. Okay, and here's this very interesting passage, which we'll have more time to look at when we get there. But for now, we can kind of tease you with a little bit. So in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22, the author says, you have arrived to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the congregation of the firstborn. And that's actually a firstborn in the plural, by the way. It's the firstborn people, the firstborn ones. And you're thinking, this sounds strange. Like I'm living where I'm living right now, and you're telling me that I've arrived at Mount Zion? What does that even mean? Or even for the readers who probably live in Rome, and the author saying, you have arrived at Mount Zion. This is God's city. And he's like, oh, this is the heavenly Jerusalem. Okay. And there is a congregation here of God's people. Like, so there's something that's going on here that is describing a present experience of the people of God as being at Mount Zion. They are citizens of Mount Zion. They are citizens of the city of the living God, which is specifically called the heavenly Jerusalem. Okay. Notice it's not the physical Jerusalem. Okay. They are citizens of a heavenly Jerusalem. They're already citizens right now. They've already arrived. Okay. They have arrived. There's a bunch of angels there, and they are a part of this congregation or this church of firstborn people. All right. We can't talk about this much more now. We'll have to wait till we get to chapter 12. But this is one of these, the rule and the reign of God is already broken into the present to where the author can say stuff like this. The author can, it's basically saying you're kingdom citizens right now. As kingdom citizens right now, you have already arrived at the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Okay? So it's interesting there. So this is how Jesus can say, in the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise, because it seems that this congregation is whatever the citizens of New Jerusalem, or here it's called heavenly Jerusalem. It's called New Jerusalem in Revelation 21. This, by the way, was already referred to earlier in one of Paul's letters in Galatians chapter 4, if you want to go back and read that. Okay. All right. So the point there is that in order to demonstrate Christ's solidarity with human beings, the author quotes from Psalm 22, where David says, I'm going to praise God to my brothers. And now it's Jesus saying, I'm going to praise God to my brothers. So Jesus says human brothers and sisters in fulfillment of Scripture. Very interesting. All right. And then in chapter 2, verse 13, we have two quotations, both from Isaiah, and it's just basically like one verse after another. Okay. So, and again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given to me. All right. So we're seeing two themes here, by the way. We're seeing somebody putting their trust in God, and we're seeing children, brothers and sisters, family members that God has given to the subject. All right. So both of these quotes are the words of Isaiah himself. That's why I put the title of this slide. The prophet Isaiah's words are applied to Christ. Okay. So the quotations here from Isaiah chapter 8, verses 17 through 18. So the first quote is Isaiah 8:17, and the second quote is Isaiah chapter 8, verse 18. Okay. But now they're applied to Jesus. Guess what? Without any suggestion that Jesus is to be identified with Isaiah. Okay. We're seeing a pattern here, which means that the author of Hebrews can take passages about Old Testament figures and say, this is what Jesus is doing right now, but the author's not trying to say Jesus is that Old Testament referent. All right? Because we saw in the last verse, David did something that now Jesus is doing, but the author's not trying to say Jesus is David. Here, we have not one, but two quotes from Isaiah, but the author's not trying to say Jesus is Isaiah. In the same way, the same argument could be in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 10, that we have a Yahweh text that's quoted of Jesus, but the author's not trying to say that Jesus is Yahweh. Okay? This is the flexibility that the author is demonstrating with his quotations, and now we're demonstrating a pattern, which I think makes our particular reading of Hebrews chapter 1, verse 10 a lot more plausible. Okay. All right. So I couldn't spend the time when we were going through Hebrews chapter 1, verse 10 to make this particular point because we needed all of this time to look at these passages. All right. So the first quotation, I will put my trust in him, originally expresses Isaiah's trust in Yahweh. This is Isaiah, will put my trust in him, namely God. Okay. Now it's showing that Jesus trusted in Yahweh. Okay. I mean, if Jesus was God, why would he be putting his trust in God? That doesn't make any sense. That's just incoherent. It's illogical. It doesn't work. Okay. All right. And what's interesting here is that even though you can't see it in English, in Greek, the pronoun I is emphatic. So it's not I will put my trust in him. It's I will put my trust in him. The stress is on the subject speaking about himself. Okay. So it's emphatic there. So if you're taking notes in your English translation, you would like underline the word I, quite heavily there to kind of, if you're reading it, to stress it. It's because they're for emphasis. Okay, second quotation, the one that says, "Behold, I and the children God has given to me." Okay, so this speaks of the children of God whom God has entrusted to the prophet Isaiah's prophetic oversight. Okay, so remember in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah has this vision, and the the heavenly throne room says, "Who's going to go for us?" And Isaiah says, "Here am I, Lord, send me." And so he's got this commission to go and to preach to the children of Israel. And so a few chapters later, we have the saying, behold, I, Isaiah, and the children God has given to me." Okay. So now the same is true of Jesus, okay, who has been entrusted with the children of God. Now, when did he get this? It's the interesting question. When did he get this? Well, he got this in his God-given role as the high priest. And Jesus was appointed to be the high priest after his resurrection. I don't think Jesus was the high priest during his earthly ministry. He was not doing priestly things. All right. So just kind of sum up, because again, we have three quotations. Why are they here? What purpose are they serving in the argument? Both Psalm 22 and Isaiah 8 speak of the human solidarity that the subjects, the readers of Hebrews, share with others. Okay, sorry, the subjects being David and Isaiah. So the author of Hebrews uses this point to illustrate Jesus as an authentic human being, because Jesus has brothers and sisters. Jesus has children that God has given to him. Children as in like God's children, God's sons and daughters. Okay. So the point here is to emphasize that Jesus is a real, authentic human being. Okay. He's not some sort of impersonal human nature that was assumed onto a divine son. You do know that the specifics of the doctrine of the Trinity is that you have a divine Son of God that comes to earth, and he assumes impersonal humanity, but that impersonal humanity is not a real human person. It's not a real person with a real human soul. He's not an actual person. It's just because that would make two persons. That would make a divine person and a human person. But they'll say, no. It's one person, the divine side, and he assumed impersonal human nature. That's not the argument of Hebrews. He's a real human being, a real human person who has real brothers and sisters. You can't be a brother to Jesus if Jesus is not a real human person, if he's just impersonal human nature. All right. Verses 14 through 15. Okay. All right. Since God's children, the children that God has given to Jesus, the children that are brothers and fellow family members with Jesus, the children that share a common ancestry with Jesus. All right. Since they share flesh and blood, what does this mean? Well, flesh and blood, it might actually be in your translation as blood and flesh. I don't think the fact that it's alternated matters much. But I think this refers to humanity in their condition of being frail, in their condition of weakness, and their condition of mortality. Okay. I don't think it's a neutral term here. There are some other places in the New Testament where you might make the point that it's just a neutral term. Okay. But take, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 50, where Paul says, "Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does that which is mortal inherit that which is immortal." Okay, so the flesh and blood is further described as that which is mortal, meaning it can't enter the kingdom without receiving immortality. Okay, so I think flesh and blood here refers to the fact that humanity is weak. It dies. And of course, death is going to be a key part of the argument going forward. Okay. So Christ, who, by the way, is a brother of humanity, he voluntarily chose to suffer and to die. Okay, so this is what I think it means when it says, he himself likewise partook of the same things. Okay, Jesus partook of this frailty, weakness, and mortality by suffering and dying. Okay, now some people will read this and they'll say this is a pre-existent Jesus in heaven who decided that he was going to take on humanity. Okay, but there's nothing in the text that says that at this point. And remember, Jesus is just as human as you and I are. So this is not, I think, just a general reference to being a human being and just being someone with flesh. I think it's a more negative view in the sense of someone that's frail, weak, and mortality. And I guess it's not really a negative view. It could be a neutral perspective, and probably on the balance it is a neutral perspective that just emphasizes the fact that they are in need of God for life and for all things. And so Jesus, he took that, all right? And the death that Christ took on, and I mentioned chapter 2, verse 10, because that talked about the sufferings of Jesus. Jesus was perfected in his suffering. His suffering, of course, led to his death. So the death that Christ took upon himself is explicitly mentioned in the purpose statement, which is in order that through death, ... So let's just make sure that we're clear on what I mean by this, okay? All right. So he himself, Jesus, he partook of the same things. What are the same things? Flesh and blood. What is flesh and blood? The fact that humans are frail, weak, and mortal. Okay. And so he did this, and then this translation just puts the word that. Okay, but it's a really strong purpose statement. It means in order that. Okay, Jesus did this in order that something else might be true. Okay, so whenever I see this phrase right here, like that or in order that, I'm asking, okay, how is what is coming after connecting to what was already said? All right, so through death, Jesus might destroy the one that had the power of death, namely the devil. And then it goes on, it says that in doing so, he's not only destroying the one who had the power of death, but he's also freeing those who were subject to slavery. Okay, so that was all the aftermath of Jesus partaking of the suffering and this mortality of human beings. Okay, because hypothetically, Jesus, who was a perfect person, he didn't have to go to Jerusalem. He didn't have to go on the cross. He could have just lived a long life. Okay, a long life that was just safe from any kind of persecution. Okay, but Jesus decided. He said, "You know what? God has a plan for me, and I'm the Messiah. And the purpose of the Messiah is to represent the people and to die for them. And that's how God's going to defeat evil and sin and death. That's how God's rule is going to break into the present." Okay, so Jesus was faithful to that, which of course led to his death, and that's how he, I think, partook or shared in the frailty, weakness, and mortality of humans that die. I think that's what the author is trying to say here, because as you could see, death and death. Okay, death just shows up in this passage like 3 times over the course of two verses. So that's, again, flesh and blood seems to be something that leads to death. Let's keep going. Okay, so we get a reference here to the devil, and it seems to be like one of the more powerful statements that are attributed to the devil. Okay, no, you got the devil, you got the one who has the power of death, namely the devil. Okay, and if you're just reading through the Old Testament, that's not the impression you would get. Okay, but there are some passages in the New Testament that really kind of portray this cosmic fight and this cosmic battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and the forces of God and the forces of Satan. And you see that in Revelation. You can also see it if you read very carefully in the Gospels. You probably can get it in Ephesians chapter 6. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood. There's that passage again, but against the powers and principalities and the cosmocrats in the heavenly places and that sort of stuff. Okay. So there's a pretty consistent good versus evil cosmic battle taking place in the New Testament. So in the midst of the New Testament, this is not a surprise, but it's kind of a powerful statement here. All right. This is what the death of Jesus did. The death of Jesus destroyed the one who had the power of death. Okay. He is taken captive the strong man, you might say, if you're taking a line out of the Gospels. All right. And what's interesting here is that Jesus has brought freedom. Okay. Jesus freed those, okay, who, because they fear death, were actually subject to slavery. Okay. Now, does this mean that the death of Jesus freed all of the slaves, literal slaves? No, I don't think that's what it means. I think what he's saying here is that the death of Jesus, by defeating death and the power of death, and the one who had the power of death, he now is able to liberate those people who were afraid of death. And because they were afraid of death, they were enslaved to that fear. And that enslavement kept them from doing things because they thought, well, if I do this, I'm going to die. And so I'm not going to do this. Okay. And there are a lot of Christians. Now I'm just kind of jumping on a preaching point here. But there are a lot of Christians that they're afraid of the persecution that's going to come if they speak the truth, if they speak the gospel, if they do what's right, if they stand up for what is good. And I mean, we've had a lot of that. I mean, just look in the last month of what's been going on in America. People that stand up and they do what's right, they could be killed, they could suffer, they could lose their jobs, they could be persecuted. Okay, and because of that, some people are like, I'm afraid, I have anxiety, I'm fearful of the harassment and the persecution and the name calling. I'm afraid of whatever it might be. And so the interesting thing here is that Jesus freed the people who were subject to slavery because of fear. It's a really interesting point that I think just gets overlooked if you read this too quickly. We'll come back and we'll talk about this in the applications. But I think it's, for me, it's one of the most convicting points in reading this passage. Okay. Let's move on. Okay. We have another one of these contrasts between angels and human beings. Even though in chapter 1, there wasn't much of a contrast. It was just kind of more Jesus is greater than the angels. Here, we definitely have a contrast, okay? Jesus does not help angels. He helps the descendant of Abraham. Jesus helps the children of Abraham. Jesus helps human beings. He doesn't help angels, okay? So again, why would human beings need help? Well, human beings have the fear of death. They're enslaved to this fear because they have flesh and blood, and they're going to die. So, but angels, they're not subject to the slavery of the fear of death. Okay, you don't get the impression by reading whatever little you can discern out of angels and the sort of things that they think about in the Bible, which is not much. You don't get the impression that they are fearful and that they're enslaved to this fear. You don't get that impression. Human beings are. Okay, the readers of Hebrews are. Okay, human beings need this assistance. They need the help. They need the assistance. Okay, and again, we're seeing here Jesus can help people, and I'm asking the question: well, how is that possible? We don't know yet. We're going to learn here by the time we get to verse 17. How can Jesus help us? All right. Now, here's what's interesting here. I made this point in our first session where we talked about the wisdom Christology of the book of Hebrews. And the wisdom Christology was that within the opening chapter, actually within chapter 1, verses 2 and 3 and 4, we had 4 different things that were said about Jesus that were formerly said about God's wisdom. Here's another passage where something is said about Jesus, specifically doing something that Lady Wisdom was doing. Okay? And so we have the verb to give assistance. This is in verse 16, which shows up twice. He does not give help. So it could be translated to give help or to give assistance, okay? But he does give help. Right there. Okay, so the verb shows up twice. He doesn't, whatever, give help or give assistance. Epilamvanome is the verb in Greek. He doesn't do it to angels, but he does it to the offspring of Abraham, to human beings, okay? All right. But what's interesting is that in Sirach, one of our intertestamental books, It actually says that wisdom, personified wisdom, she teaches her children, and she, here's the same verb, gives help to, gives assistance to those who seek her. All right. So this is interesting. We have a passage about in the Old Testament, not in the Old Testament, but in the intertestamental books, about wisdom teaching her children, namely those who seek her, and she gives assistance to them. Now we have Jesus giving assistance to the children of Abraham. So I think you have like something that was formerly said about God's wisdom now being said about Jesus. And you know what? If we didn't have everything said in chapter 1, you might just kind of say, well, I don't know if that's much of a connection here. But the fact that we already have the wisdom Christology designated in chapter 1, 4 times, like back to back to back to back, really suggest here that this is an intentional reference, I think. I think the suggestion here is very strong, especially because we have the reference here to children, to brothers and sisters, okay? And the connection of assisted children, which Jesus is described as having brothers and sisters or children or family members or brethren in verses 10, 11, 12, and 13. Prior to this, I think that the wisdom connection here is really important. And again, the whole point of wisdom Christology is to say that Jesus preexisted, but he preexisted as God's wisdom. But God's wisdom is just a personification of God's wise instructions to his creation, God's wise interaction with his creation, God's wise way of bringing order to chaos. That's one of God's attributes, his wisdom. Everyone has their own wisdom, but Jesus seems to be the embodiment of God's wisdom. Okay, so hopefully that didn't blow over people's heads. Okay, those who know what I'm talking about know that's a big deal. Okay, so finally we have in verse 17, we have the introduction of the high priest. Okay, Jesus was made like his brethren in all things. Okay, all things, every possible way. Okay, which means if Jesus is like human beings in all ways, then he's fully human. He can't be impersonal human nature if he's like humans in all ways. Okay, human beings are individual persons, they're individual selves, they're individual souls. They have their own will, they have their own mind, they can make their own choices. Okay, Jesus is like human beings in every way. Okay, let me erase and make sure that we're clear to see that there. Okay, he had to be made like his brethren in all things, in every way. Why? Why did Jesus need to be made that way? So that he might become the high priest. But what kind of high priest? A merciful high priest and a faithful high priest. If Jesus is faithful, to whom is he faithful? Answer, he's faithful to God. Remember, he's singing praises to God, okay? He's telling of God's name to his brethren, okay? Right here, it's the high priest in things pertaining to God. So obviously Jesus is not God if he's the high priest to God. Okay, they're clearly distinguished. Okay, and Jesus, of course, did this by dying for the sins of the people, making propitiation for the sins of the people, which is what the high priest does once a year. Okay, so this is the first time in Christian history that Jesus is described as the high priest explicitly. Okay, now the author knows that he needs to go back and explain this, okay? But he's not going to have the time to explain it right now. He's going to have to come back and explain it a little bit later, okay? But it gets introduced here for the first time, and we know that part of the relationship here is that Jesus was a genuine human being who could relate to other human beings. He was faithful, he endured, he suffered. Therefore, God exalted Jesus, God raised Jesus, God perfected Jesus, and appointed Jesus in the position of the high priest so that Jesus can sympathize with us. How can Jesus sympathize with us as a high priest? Well, because he's gone through all the same things. He's experienced all the same suffering. He's done all these things first. It's a big deal. All right? So Jesus is fully human, he's merciful, and he's faithful in things pertaining to God. And of course, Jesus did not always have this role of the high priest. God gave it to him. God appointed Jesus to that role. All right. Verse 18. All right. This is kind of the conclusion of the section here. All right. The concluding sentence of this section: he himself was tempted in that which he suffered. He is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. This actually baits the readers, and it has a lot of teasing statements that are going to be unpacked later in the book of Hebrews. So it's kind of it's like an interesting conclusion to this section, but it's a cliffhanger as well to things that are going to be unpacked like in chapter after chapter after chapter going on. Okay, so there's a lot that's right here. It's packed in, but he's not going to explain it. So all we can do is just kind of make some general remarks and then patiently wait for the author to unpack his own argument. Okay, so the he himself is actually emphatic. Okay, it's not saying that he was tempted. It's he himself was tempted. That extra pronoun there is deliberate. It's there in the Greek text, and it's there for emphasis. It stresses that the human Messiah personally was tempted. Remember, God can't be tempted. God cannot be tempted according to James 1:13. Okay? It's the same verb. Okay? Whatever happened to Jesus, God can't have happened to him. It's impossible. Okay? And so, there are going to be some people that say, well, maybe it only happened to the human side of Jesus, but it didn't happen to the divine side if you believe in the Trinity. But the problem, though, is that if you believe in the Trinity, you don't believe that the human side is a real person. Hebrews here is explicitly saying he himself was tempted. A real human person was tempted. I mean, you can't fit Hebrews into the doctrine of the Trinity. It doesn't work. Okay? We're just seeing here that there's a fully mortal human person that's being described with Jesus throughout this passage. And of course, Jesus' ability and his capacity to come to the aid is due to his appointment to the role of high priest after his resurrection. Okay? So notice, Jesus is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted because he was already tempted in the things which he suffered. Okay? Remember, his suffering concludes with his death. So Jesus was tempted, he suffered, he died. Now he's able to come to the aid of those who are tempted, meaning his ability to come to the aid comes after his suffering and death, likely his installment as the high priest. Okay? So again, he hasn't made the connection there of the high priest and the aid, but I think we can anticipate that because of what was already said. And of course, if you've read through the rest of Hebrews, you know that's a conclusion that the author is going to make. Okay, all right. So how can we take passages that stress the humanity of Jesus and his role as the high priest? How can we apply them to our lives today? I've got 4 applications, 4 ways you can apply this passage to your life. Number 1, Christ, our example, was perfected through an obedient life of suffering, giving us a model for how we too should obediently endure in this life in order to receive our perfected resurrection bodies. So I'm working here on the point of perfection. Christ became perfect through his sufferings. God perfected Jesus by raising Jesus from the dead and giving him immortality. Okay? We are going to be perfected similarly by following in the example of Jesus, who endured, who was steadfast, who was faithful. He had to die. It's very likely that most Christians are going to die and be raised in the resurrection. Okay, Christians are far more likely to die than they are to be alive when Jesus comes back. That's just statistics. Okay, but the point is, if we want to have a perfected resurrection body, a resurrection body that is immortal, then we need to follow the example of Jesus, who showed us how to be perfected. All right, and he did it by being obedient through suffering, by being faithful through suffering. Okay, remember Isaiah chapter 8, verse 17? I will put my faith in him. I will put my trust in him. Quoted of Jesus. Jesus, the one that put his faith and trust in God. All right. Number 2, the full humanity of Jesus, our human brother, should help us relate to not only what he went through, but also how he endured in faithfulness to God. My point here is that the full humanity of Jesus makes him relatable. If Jesus was a man just like you and I, then I can relate to what he went through. He can relate to us as well as the high priest. because he experienced the same things. He actually was hurt. He actually bled. He actually suffered. He was actually the recipient of persecution. Okay? I mean, you can't bleed God. You can bleed the human Messiah. The fact that he's fully human, I think, makes it easier to follow him. He's more relatable. And the author is going to make the point that Jesus can sympathize with us because he's as human as we are. All right. Intimidation and fear experienced by believers often contribute to lower church attendance, wavering faith, loss of focus, and demotivation. Okay. So foreseeing these experiences, foreseeing intimidation and fear, God prepared Christ to serve as the forerunner of faith in a way that equipped him, that equipped Christ to sympathize with his followers. We know from the book of Hebrews that the community that was reading the letter, some of them had stopped their attending in the Sunday meeting. Okay. Either through fear or intimidation or whatever it may be. Okay. We know that many of them are wavering in their faith. We know that they're floating away. Okay. They're drifting away in their faith. And the book of Hebrews is trying to give them the anchor for their soul. Okay. And of course, if you aren't going to church and if you're wavering in your faith, then you're not focusing. Okay. You're not enduring. You're not being faithful. And you're constantly going to be demotivated if you're intimidated and you have, the fear of death. If the fear of death enslaves you to not gathering with other believers, to not being faithful, to not focusing, and to not being motivated to preach the truth and be the light to the world and be the salt to the earth, then you're being enslaved by those things. And so it's interesting that God had prepared the life of Jesus so that he can be the author and perfecter of our faith, of faith itself, because he was the one who had faith in God. He was the forerunner of faith, okay? And Jesus, as the high priest, he's able to sympathize with us, okay? He didn't let intimidation get to him. He didn't let fear get to him. And the fear of death is actually answered with God raising Jesus from the grave. The fact that God can raise and God can immortalize the dead is why we should neither fear death nor dread the persecution that faithful believers regularly experience. I mean, death's not the end because God can raise the dead. God's proven it with Jesus. And God's promised that he's going to raise the dead when Jesus comes back. So we shouldn't fear death. And I keep thinking from the perspective of eternity. Let's just say that you live a long life. Let's say that you live 90 years and you die of old age. Okay? 90 years sounds like a lot. Okay? But from the perspective of being raised to immortality, and you live for 1 billion years, you're going to look back on that 90 years as like a speck of sand. It's nothing. It was small. And we're going to look back on some of the things that we got bent out of shape over, or we got upset over, or that we didn't do out of fear or intimidation. And we're going to wonder why we did that. Because in the perspective of living forever in eternity, they don't mean anything. They're so small. They're so insignificant. And so we shouldn't let fear enslave us from doing what is right. God has proven that he can raise the dead. He's proven that with Jesus. And we can trust that if God has done it with Jesus, he's going to do it with us as well. So we got to endure. We got to be faithful. We got to continue to fight the good fight and to be kingdom citizens and to be loyal and faithful and to seek first the kingdom of God. And there's no reason to fear death because death is just going to be like a little blip in our history, because the next moment of our consciousness, we're going to be raised from the dead. Anyway, I can preach on this for a long time. I don't want to do that. Let me kind of stop things and I'll close the video. If you're watching this, if you want to have some interaction, just reach out to us in the comments and we'll try to interact with you. Thanks for watching. I appreciate this. Hopefully this has been uplifting and beneficial to you. I will see you next time.